I've become interested in this topic because I think it's one of the biggest challenges facing the turfgrass industry today in 2019, and it's only going to become more of a challenge moving forward. And I've seen that myself, in my extension programs now. I get more questions about glyphosate. I've had more questions about glyphosate in the past 3 months probably than I had in 10 years combined. Everyone has seen this. Everyone is familiar with this. It is omnipresent now in society. You get up early in the morning at 5 in the morning, you make yourself a cup of coffee, you turn the TV on, you're probably going to see an ad for some law firm telling you, hey, if you've been exposed to glyphosate, call this number, we can make you a millionaire, right? That's where we are. And I don't think that that's going to go away anytime soon. In sports turf, we've seen this for a while. We have states with pesticide bans. So this is Connecticut's pesticide ban for sports fields on school grounds. I know we have folks in here from Maryland. I talked to several folks from Montgomery County yesterday, and they're facing challenges on pesticide use in that county. I'm certain, Ben, in Massachusetts, there are municipalities that put certain restrictions on what we can and cannot do in terms of using pesticides on a sports field. And I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon. If anything, it's probably just going to become more common and get a little bit more stringent. So the idea for today's presentation actually came to me after hearing this gentleman speak. So I was invited to speak at the Florida Turfgrass Conference 2 years ago. And the gentleman pictured, Dr. Kevin FOLTA, he gave a presentation, and it was a really interesting presentation to listen to. He's a professor and department chair at the University of Florida, and he's devoted his whole career to working in strawberry genomics and looking at DNA in strawberries and certain traits associated with flavor profiles and ripening. I mean, he's a really knowledgeable scientist when it comes to strawberries. But that's not what his talk was about. So what his talk was about was basically his story. So the U.S. Right to Know, which is a group funded by the Organic Consumers Association, they filed a Freedom of Information Act against him as a faculty member at the University of Florida. And what that allowed them to do was seize all of his email, all of his electronic communications, anything he had ever published in his time working in strawberry genomics. Because Dr. FOLTA is a very pro-biotechnology person and feels that genetic engineering and GMOs are ways to increase food production, particularly in parts of the world where environmental conditions aren't going to allow for maximal yield, this group had an opposite viewpoint and took it under their auspices to slander this man on the internet. I mean, just absolutely slander him and everything that he's ever done. Dr. FOLTA, he since then has become very outspoken. And I've had an opportunity to, hear him speak multiple times now, and, his opinion is that there is so much bad information on the internet when it comes to science. It is our job as people who believe in science and in good information to put good information back on the internet, right? And he's done that. He advocates for people like me who work in universities to do that as well. And he's become a really outspoken advocate for scientific communication and communicating relevant scientific information to public audiences. And he explains in his work that he's taken a very different approach to doing this, like a radically different approach. He walks through two textbooks that you can see here. So this book is Never Split the Difference, Negotiating as Your Life Depended on It by Chris VOSS. And then this is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Both of these are wonderful reads, and I would highly recommend them to anybody. We're going to talk a lot about these books today. They're really the basis for this presentation. I heard Dr. FOLTA speak and then went and took the time to read these because I thought it could be really helpful in talking about pest management practices in sports turf. And what they all kind of get back to is Dr. FOLTA, he summarizes what he's done, and the new approach that he's taken is he started to study hostage negotiation. I'm just going to let that sink in, because when I gave the webinar on this topic, there was certainly some head scratching in the comments about how that metaphor would work. But I think when we walk through the metaphor, it's going to make some sense. So this is a graphic picture, so I'm sorry if it offends anybody, but this is a hostage situation. We look at this, what's going on in this photo, right? Well, this situation's highly emotional. It's emotionally charged, right? There are emotions in this person as the captive. There are emotions in this person as the hostage taker, right? A highly emotionally charged situation. There's a lack of rational thought here, right? If you think about it, this gentleman, is he worried about the fact that, he might have to deal with the moral consequences of ending this person's life? Or he's probably, if this ends in nobody getting harmed, he's probably going to go to jail. He's going to be in prison forever. He's going to have his life ruined. He's never going to see his family again. Do you think he's thinking about that right now? Probably not, right? There's not rational thought or rational dot connecting, so to speak, going on here. The other thing here is that if you're asked to become involved in this situation and you're too aggressive, it's probably going to make the problem worse, right? And being overly aggressive is going to make this situation go to a place where nobody wants it to end. So if we think about that, just those traits of what's going on in this interaction of human beings, and we look at what we face in sports turf, it's not all that different, right? We look at this is highly emotional, right? These people have taken time out of their day to make these signs, right? In March, wherever this picture was taken, I don't know. I grabbed it off the internet from the website listed below. But it's highly emotional, right? There's also a lack of rational thought. I don't think the person in this photo cares one bit about an LD50, right? At all. That's not relevant to anything going on in this situation. And being overly aggressive with this person's probably just going to make the situation worse. They're going to become more cemented in their opinion, and the person that's overly aggressive is going to become more cemented in theirs. And then nobody wins. The problem just perpetuates and continues to fester and not get any better. So as a sports turf manager, what can you do in this world? And again, I am not an expert here. I have taken an interest in this, and I want to kind of share what I've learned as I've tried to learn more about this. And one of the things you can do is become a better communicator. I'll say, as somebody who communicates a lot as part of their job, I think one of the things that we do in sports turf, and really turf in general, is we talk to ourselves a lot, right? It's real comfortable to talk to people in the industry about what we do and how the other groups don't understand us, and we talk to ourselves. We have ample opportunity for training in the science related to turfgrass and growing healthy turfgrass, right? Conferences like this, regional meetings, chapter meetings. We have every opportunity in the world to talk about what we do agronomically in terms of growing healthy turf. But in my opinion, we have very little training as an industry about how to discuss what we do with a public audience. And honestly, with a public audience that's largely uninformed about what we do, right? That's lacking, I think, in terms of what we have as educational opportunities within our discipline. And there's tactics out there to be effective at doing this. And they're the same tactics that, NGOs, that stands for non-government organization, are using with the public at large to incite, let's call it, the other side of this argument, right? One of those tactics, and we're going to delve into this, is to better understand human nature. So to do that, I want to reference again this book, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Daniel Kahneman is a Nobel Prize winner in economics, and what he did in writing this book was he studied decision-making, particularly how people make decisions about how they spend money. And what he learned by doing that is that the kind of mechanics of how those decisions are made are the same as how all decisions are made in human beings. And he explains that in this book. And to kind of break this down, he talks about there's two systems for decision making, and this is really simple. He calls them System 1 and System 2. System 1 is basically the process in your brain that if we heard a loud noise in the hallway right now, something exploded, every single one of us would make the decision to turn around and look, right? You didn't have to think about it, you just reacted. It's just that instinctual decision to react. System 2 is the process in your brain that allows you to solve a math problem of, x is equal to 2 plus 5 plus the quantity of 10 divided by 2. You couldn't do that as quickly as you could turn around if there was an explosion in the hallway. You'd have to pause, think through that, and then get to an answer. And what Kahneman explains in his book is that nearly every single decision that human beings make comes from System 1, from that reactionary process of turning around when you hear a loud noise in the hallway or anything of that nature. So what's that mean to us in sports turf? What that means to us in sports turf, and this is sad, as somebody who works to generate data for a living, is that data and scientific logic don't really matter, right? When it comes to decision making on this issue, this is probably something where data and scientific logic aren't going to be impactful, right? You look at this again, I can have 150 papers on the safety of 2,4-D to human beings. We can talk about decades and decades of university research about glyphosate safety and how glyphosate doesn't affect mammals, and it's one of the safest compounds ever invented. It is going to have no impact on decision-making here, right? Just like rational thought and logic have no impact on decision-making here. There's a line in Kahneman's book, and I highlighted this in the book when I read it, and I'll remember it forever. The emotional tail wags the rational dog. And I think that that's a really true statement when we talk about pest management practices with a public audience, that we need to know, as sports turf managers going into this, that the emotional tail is going to wag the rational dog in that conversation. Now, the other thing about human nature, I think that's important, that is explained in Kahneman's book, is that people overestimate the likelihoods of rare events, right? They overestimate the likelihood that something extremely rare will happen. And he explains that that's because that decision-making process in the human brain, System 1, it doesn't understand probability. And this is one of the examples he gives in the book. Think about this situation. We have two cities, and an alert comes out that they're under attack, right? That there's bombers in the city to attack them. Citizens of City 1 are notified that there are two bombers at different locations in the city. Citizens of City 2 are notified that there's only a single bomber. Citizens of City 2 have half the chance of a negative event happening, but do you think that they feel any safer? They probably don't. Think about that in your town. I don't think you would feel any safer, even though the risk of a negative is 50% lower, right? People overestimate the likelihood of rare events. So when we think about that in the context of sports turf, they overestimate the likelihood that harm is going to be placed upon their children or family or what have you from a spray event, whatever that spray event may be. The other component of human nature that Kahneman walks through is loss aversion, that people they prefer to avoid loss rather than acquire a gain. And you can look, and he explains this, you look into the literature about this topic, is that the weight of a loss is 2 times greater than the weight of a gain. You know, and if you think about that, if you walk back to the hotel from the convention center today and you lost $100 and fell out of your pocket, that would probably anger you more than if you walked out of this room and kicked over a rock and found a $100 bill. The amount that you would be happy that you found the 100 is probably less than the anger you would feel from losing the 100, right? And there's lots of data out there to prove that to be true. And he explains that this is because regret and responsibility are really powerful emotions. And there's a specific pesticide example in this book, again, written by a Nobel Prize winner. He talks about they surveyed individuals about an insecticide. Insecticide A and insecticide B. And both of these have risk, right? Just like anything we do. When we crossed the street today from the hotel to the convention center, there was a risk associated with doing that. So insecticide A has a risk of child harm of 15 in 10,000 bottles. Insecticide B has a risk of child harm in 16 in 10,000 bottles, but is a substantially lower cost. They surveyed parents about whether or not they would switch from insecticide A to insecticide B. Which one would they purchase, right? Would they take this one or this one? Would they be willing to switch even though the risk of harm is slightly higher? One event in 10,000. I'm not good enough at math to do that percentage in my head, but I know that it's very low, right? When they did this, 66% of the parents said they wouldn't switch from insecticide A to insecticide B, despite the substantial cost savings, because of the increase in risk. People overestimate the likelihood of a rare event. Then the other component of human nature that he explains is relevant to this discussion is what's called the precautionary principle. And that's a feeling that we need to prohibit any action that could potentially cause harm. And what that really means is that scientific data showing no damage is not a justification for taking a risk, right? So think about that in regards to like the GMO conversation in Europe. Europe has banned GMO foods, despite the fact that every World Health Organization on planet Earth has declared them safe, right? More data than one could ever get to justify safety. That's not enough to move the envelope forward, right? They're prohibiting any action that could potentially cause harm, even though we have no evidence to believe that harm will occur. And he walks through in the book the innovations that would not exist on planet Earth if we applied this to everything that we do, including airplanes, air conditioning, antibiotics, automobiles, chlorine, measles vaccine, open heart surgery, radio, refrigeration, smallpox vaccine, and x-rays. If we applied that logic to everything, that is just a subset of the things that we would not have, right? Again, evidence to show that this is certainly something that we need to be aware of. So again, as a sports turf manager, how do you navigate through this? I don't even know what the right word would be to describe that environment. So we have to understand that the principle of cognitive ease, and this is a direct quote from his book. Cognitive ease is when you build the best possible story from the information available to you, and then if it's a good story, you believe it. The amount of evidence and quality do not count much because poor evidence can make a very good story, right? And that Kahneman makes an argument that this is true in every human being. This is a nice dressed up way to talk about what we have heard about for several years now as fake news. And there's been new research. This is a 2018 research. This is a media article from Time, but this was done at Stanford University. You can look up the actual paper. Authors are Weinberg et al. Basically, they walk through a research study about how the brain is wired to believe fake news. Basically, all that is really doing is telling you that the cognitive ease principle exists in every human being. that if something sounds believable, your brain will tell you that that is true. This allows narratives not based in fact to perpetuate in society, right? And we see these a lot. There are narratives out there about the harm of pesticides to humans, and we need to avoid this at all costs, at costs that are maybe more than even one can comprehend. So I'll contend that what we need to do to navigate this as a sports turf industry is we need to get better about telling our story, right? And telling our narrative, because we have not only a great story to tell, we have a lot of facts and data to support that story, right? That have been generated over a really long time. So to do this, we have to get better at messaging, and particularly proactive messaging. And we have to do this knowing that human beings are risk averse, right? Understanding human nature, like we talked about earlier. So if we know that human beings are risk averse, we want to talk about the risk of not managing pests rather than the benefits of safety of doing so, right? Now let's walk through an example. So we have a soccer field. We have some parents along the side of the soccer field here. Conversation. Imagine yourself in the shoes of this sports turf manager. You know, one could take the approach of saying we need to spray the field for grubs. The treatment's completely safe. It won't harm the kids at all. Hundreds of research trials have shown this response. It's true, right? Insecticides make the market. They've been vetted through research for a long, long time. We have an environmental protection agency. Love them or hate them, they're not going to let something onto the market that's going to be harmful to children based on the amount of environmental fate data that is needed to get something registered. So we think about that statement, that is really emphasizing data and benefit, not really getting to the risk-averse point. So let's reframe this now. We can have the same conversation and pose it this way. If we don't do something about the insects, kids are going to get hurt. I'm worried kids might injure themselves on weak turf from insect damage, right? That's approaching the same topic, understanding human beings being risk averse, right? And that if we don't do something, the kids are at risk, right? Reframing the discussion. And I think it's important, and Kahneman explains this in his book, that we have to realize that emotions play a role in this again. You know, we want to talk about the number of successful applications rather than the small percentage of something harmful, right? And don't use data with no human component. So rather, use something that's pretty vivid. I'm a big fan of metaphors because I think people can understand metaphors very well. Right? So we want to talk about the number of applications that are successful. So here again, we can look at this. The chances of harm from this application are less than 0.01%. True, right? Well, there's no emotion in that. We understand that decision-making really doesn't understand what 0.01% means, right? That's pretty easy to forget. Let's reframe that. And we'll take the percentage out. We'll talk about this in metaphor. And I looked this up to make sure that the percentages match. You know, you could look at this and go, a child is more likely to die in a Grand Prix race than being harmed from this treatment. Right? The percentages are the same. Now, this may seem silly. I understand that. Right? But the message here is that word choice matters. Right? We need to think about our word choice when we're trying to communicate what we do in sports turf management. But I'll tell you, word choice alone and cute metaphors aren't going to get the job done, right? That's just a kind of a talking point. Because when you're in the middle of one of these conversations, in the heat of the moment, that's the metaphors and whatnot aren't going to work. And we need some skills to kind of deal with the person that's holding that sign that we talked about earlier. So this is a book that gets into that, again, that Dr. FOLTA talked about when I originally got the idea to put this slide set together. So the book is Never Split the Difference. The author is Chris VOSS. Chris is an FBI hostage negotiator. He worked for the FBI for 24 years. He was the chief international hostage and kidnapping negotiator, from 2003 to 2007. He's an adjunct professor at Georgetown, and what he explains is that the lessons that he learned in the FBI really apply everywhere. And what he works through in his book is basically the science of negotiation, right? And he'll argue that the majority of the interactions that we have every day, whether it's at work or at home, they boil down to a simple expression of, I want you to free the hostages. I want you to accept this contract. I want to pay $20,000 for this car. I want a 10% raise. I want you to go to bed at 9 p.m. He makes a case that everything we do is a negotiation, whether it's with your boss, whether your colleagues, whether it's with a merchant that you're going to buy something from, whether it's with your children. Everything gets back to negotiation, and we need to understand how to be better in that human exchange to successfully work our way through that. One of the principles is the 7-38-55 rule. This was put together by Albrecht Mehrabian, a UCLA psychology professor. And his work has showed that 7% of how a message is received is based on words, 38% is based on tone of voice, and 55% is based on body language. And what Chris explains in his book is when he was called into these really tenuous hostage negotiations, you have to acknowledge this. And I think the same is true for us in sports turf. If you're in a heated conversation about spraying a pesticide on a sports field, you have to understand that your words matter, but your tone of voice is going to matter. Your body language is going to matter. He talks in the book about using a late-night FM DJ voice. I don't really know that I can imitate that right now, but I think the message is more that we need to stay calm. It could be a really heated discussion from the other side, and if you want to win the negotiation, so to speak, it's important for you to stay calm and level-headed. And one of the other tactics that he says is used in the FBI that is actionable for us is the tactic of mirroring. And what this is you repeat the key points that the other person says in a really soft voice and you don't rush through it, right? You play the long game here. Because what this does is it allows you to understand that people are going to be drawn to what's similar to them, and it shows that you understand the other person, that you're listening, right? If somebody talks to you and you can repeat what they say, it shows them that you're listening and you understand the message that they're trying to deliver to you. And this is what's called building tactical empathy, right? Labeling your counterpart's emotions and points to show them that you're listening, because this is really what's needed to diffuse the situation. And, Chris argues in the book that when they were in these FBI situations trying to negotiate with hostages, that you really try to focus on your counterpart's fears, right? Because if you can interrupt the action of the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that generates fear, the faster you can do that, you can build feelings of safety and trust, right? So let's look through this in kind of a situation of what it might be in a pest management discussion, right? So you can imagine, a parent comes to you and, they see you with a spray tank and they're concerned that it could be glyphosate or dicamba or whatever active you want. They are just really upset that a treatment's going to go down in that field. What are ways that you could try to build that tactical empathy to diffuse the situation? It looks like you're concerned about the fact that we're using a pesticide. It sounds like you think children's safety are going to be compromised. It seems like you have some alternative thoughts on how to manage the field and keep children safe, right? That's mirroring what the person is saying, right? and it's recognizing their emotions and fears. And the key thing here is notice that none of those use the word I, right? They start with it seems, it sounds, it looks, right? Because using the word I tells the counterpart who's emotionally charged in coming at you that you're more interested in yourself than you are with them. Now, you may be sitting in the audience going, they need to understand me. That's garbage, right? Well, not to get silly, but to quote everybody's favorite mobster, it's not personal, it's just business. And Voss talks about this in his book. Talks about the discipline needed to be effective in negotiation, right? And they train this in FBI agents. And it's something that's going to be true with what we do in these conversations about pest management. He explains, this is a quote from the book, it's about the party convincing themselves that the solution you want is their own idea. So you don't beat them with logic or brute force. Ask them questions that open paths to your goals. It's not about you. And I think that's really important here, that this is going to be a long game, and to be successful in doing this, you have to walk your counterpart to the solution so they think it's their idea. And one of the tactics he gives in the book to do this is to provide an accusation audit, right? What this is basically you list the worst things that your counterpart could say about you before they could do it, right? And you may think, well, that's kind of weird. Well, what that does is it gets them on the table so you can prevent them from being used against you, right? And often these things sound really exaggerated when they're said aloud, right? Here's an example and an unbelievable picture to go with the example. It seems like you think I love spraying chemicals and I do so as often as possible. It seems like you think I'm just an uneducated guy who cuts grass and sprays chemicals every day. Imagine yourself, if you're in one of these discussions and you put that out there, your counterpart's going to walk that back, right? Because it sounds ridiculous when that's said aloud, right? And that's going to be helpful, and they'll walk that back, and it's going to prevent those from being used against you and basically de-escalate the emotions of the situation. And again, I'm not an expert in this by any means. I'm just sharing what I learned by reading in a book. What this does, again, Voss will argue that what we want to do here is create the illusion of control. If you're in a discussion about a glyphosate application around a school, you don't want to force your counterpart to admit that glyphosate is safe. That's a losing approach, right? You don't want to force your counterpart to say, you're right, I'm wrong, I'll go home now, because that's not going to happen, right? Voss will argue you don't want to ask questions that can be answered with the word yes, right? Because that requires little to no thought, right? You want your counterpart to walk and think about what's happening. It is very easy to quickly rip off a yes or a no. And this, to me, this is the tactic that really resonated with me the most. And I've used this at home with my daughter to try to get her to brush her teeth, right? It's using calibrated questions that begin with how or what. You're asking for help. And that gives the illusion that the person you're talking to is in control of what's happening, right? So think about this as you walk through discussions about pest management. What and how questions. Think about yourself talking to a parent or talking to somebody that is really upset about pesticide use on your field. What's important to you? How can I make this better for us? How would you like for me to proceed? How can we solve this problem? What is it that brought us to this situation? And this is probably the most important one. How am I supposed to do that? And Voss will argue that's a replacement for no. So you can imagine a scenario where a parent or a coach or a citizen is like, I don't want you to use any chemicals on this field. And you respond with, how am I supposed to do that? Right? And again, it's a long game, but continually staying disciplined to that process walks them into a situation that both parties can live with. Again, it makes your counterpart find the solution that they'll feel is their own. You can steer the negotiation where you want to go, right? But it takes patience and discipline and an understanding that it's going to take a really long time for this to end. This is a really great quote on this, a really great quote kind of that sums up the whole approach here. And it's from Robert Easterbrook, who's the former editor of the Washington Post. And his quote is as follows: "He who has learned to disagree without being disagreeable has discovered the most variable secret of negotiation." And to me, that really speaks to everything Voss works through in his book, which is you are walking your counterpart to the solution that you want to get to, but they will leave thinking that it's their idea, right? And I think that is really the tactic that can be helpful in diffusing that situation. So I intentionally left this a little short on time because, again, I'm not an expert here, and I think if we have a frank discussion and maybe some exchanges of things you've seen where you live and scenarios that you have been in, we can all learn together. I'm going to wrap up here with a few conclusions, and hopefully we can have some, open dialogue and exchange as a group. So in conclusion, the message here is to understand the audience, system 1 versus system 2 decision making. And, it's easy to remember. If you hear an explosion in the hallway, what causes you to turn around is system 1. The system in your brain that allows you to know this, 2 to the third power plus 50 divided by 6, that is system 2, the part that requires a little bit of thought and logic and process, and that really all the decisions that are made in human nature, by and large, are made with the system 1 part of the brain. And that human nature, the principles of loss aversion, that people will do more to avoid loss than they will to acquire a gain, emotional thinking, and then cognitive ease, which is a dressed up way to talk about fake news, that those are principles that affect how people make decisions. And that really, that is a nice wrapped up package to say that when we come to these situations, they're emotionally charged and that the decisions are really not going to be based on fact, right? You can remember that quote, the emotional tail wags the rational dog. Then remember the hostage example, right? The principles from Chris Voss's book. Tone of voice matters. Body language matters. Calibrated questions that begin with how and what. And then really it's not personal. It may seem personal, and again, it's easy for me to say it's not personal, not being in the heat of the moment. No one's coming at me saying that I'm the devil because I want to put out Trimec to kill some dandelions. But it's not personal. And if you want to be successful in navigating through this, I think it's important to remember that.